Flight attendant slaps blind man. Not knowing what happens next will shock everyone. Welcome, dear listeners and viewers, to a tale that takes flight quite literally and plunges headlong into an unexpected clash between humility and arrogance. Today, we unravel the extraordinary events that occurred on a commercial airplane where tensions soared to unimaginable heights. This story explores the unforgettable moment when a flight attendant, blinded by prejudice, struck a blind passenger with no inkling that he was a world-renowned social media influencer. Yet the turbulence in this saga goes far beyond mere physical conflict. Betrayals, confessions, surprises, and shocking twists weave together to create a nail-biting journey that compels us to question everything we assume about one another. So strap in and prepare for a riveting flight unlike any you have heard before. Before we dive in, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. If you're excited about this story, let us know. If you enjoyed the video, press 1. If not, press O. Your feedback really inspires me to gather more uplifting and meaningful stories. It was just past 4 o'clock in the morning at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The grand halls, ordinarily thrumming with the energy of midday travelers, were eerily calm under the fluorescent lights. A handful of souls drifted from seat to seat, clutching overstuffed carry-ons. The overhead announcements were sporadic, echoing across near-empty gates, adding an otherworldly quality to the quiet. Yet for some, even this pre-dawn hush carried the promise of possibility or dread. In the corner sat a slender man with dark glasses, hunched over a small braille note. His name was Gareth Malone. He traced the raised letters slowly, lips moving in silent repetition. Shiny black hair, trimmed precisely around his ears, contrasted with his lightly bronzed complexion. At his feet lay a sleek cane with a metallic tip. It was easy to overlook him, to assume he was just another traveler, if not for the occasional glance from the night staff as they passed by. Gareth was tired, but a bolt of anxiety ran through him every time he pictured stepping onto the plane. Traveling blind was no novelty to him. He had been visually impaired since childhood. Though he managed quite well, the occasional humiliating encounter, the well-meant pity, or the brusque impatience from some airline staff always made him a bit queasy. Nevertheless, he wore a small smile. There was more to Gareth than met the eye. The braille note he studied was an itinerary part of a global content creation project he had been working on. Yet no one around him seemed to suspect he was more than a quiet passenger. Standing near a coffee kiosk was Harriet, a junior flight attendant who had transferred to Delta Airlines only a few months earlier. She was impeccably groomed, hair pinned into a perfect bun, uniform crisply pressed. Her posture conveyed an almost military discipline. However, beneath the professional facade lurked an undercurrent of fatigue and stress. Harriet was grappling with life's burdens, overdue rent, friction with her roommate, and a parent's rising medical bills. None of which were the fault of any passenger, but the weight she felt was undeniable. As Harriet stretched her arms, letting out an exasperated sigh, she spotted Gareth sitting alone. She watched him for a moment, noticing the cane at his feet. A pang of annoyance flickered in her. Special needs passengers had to be assisted throughout the flight, and Harriet already felt stretched thin. She dreaded that she might be assigned to personally escort him, from boarding to deplaning, in the midst of everything else. It was a small inconvenience, but Harriet, in her volatile emotional state, let it fester in her mind as another heavy burden. An older colleague passed by and patted Harriet's shoulder encouragingly, a gentle reminder that empathy was part of their duty. Harriet mustered a tight-lipped smile, but the seed of resentment had already taken root. She finished her coffee, squared her shoulders, and prepared to begin the pre-flight briefing. Some distance away, near a window that overlooked the runway, sat a woman who would soon be instrumental to Gareth's fate. Vivienne Barrett was a freelance journalist known for her in-depth features on the hidden lives of social media icons. She was traveling under instructions from a major digital publication. Word had reached her that Gareth Malone, legally blind since he was 8, was building a massive platform with millions of followers across platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. The blind influencer was rumored to be working on a hush-hush philanthropic project related to accessible technology. Vivienne's editor had asked her to find and interview Gareth, but there was a catch. He was notoriously private. Apart from the occasional cameo at conferences for disability rights, he scarcely disclosed personal details. Very few even knew his face, which made him all the more intriguing. As Vivienne sipped her latte, her gaze drifted across the terminal. She suspected Gareth might be on the flight, but she had no photograph to guide her, only a vague description that he was in his late 20s, possessed a well-groomed appearance, and often used a stylish silver-tipped cane. Seeing Gareth in real life would confirm all her speculations. Soon, boarding began. Gareth rose unsteadily, carefully folding his braille itinerary and tucking it into his jacket pocket. The gate agent noticed his cane and stepped forward politely, offering to assist him onto the aircraft early. Gareth managed a smile, appreciative of the courtesy. He waited as the passengers lined up, then allowed the agent to guide him. Harriet hovered near the jet bridge entrance, scanning boarding passes as passengers made their way into the plane. When Gareth arrived, Harriet let out a weary exhale. This was exactly what she had anticipated, additional responsibility. She put on the obligatory smile. "Welcome aboard, sir," Harriet said, her voice clipped. "Would you like assistance to your seat?" "I can manage with the help of the gate agent," Gareth replied. He spoke gently, but Harriet sensed a quiet confidence in his tone. "Very well," she responded. "Our flight to LAX is about 6 hours. Let me know if you need anything." As Gareth proceeded, Harriet couldn't resist rolling her eyes, though no one seemed to notice. A growing tension stirred in her chest. Once Gareth was seated in 14A, a window seat. Though it made no difference to him, he carefully placed his cane against the seat and ran his hand over the overhead panel to locate the call button, just in case. The plane was slowly filling, the hush of the terminal replaced by a cacophony of overhead bins slamming, seatbelts clicking, and excited chatter. Harriet walked down the aisle with a forced smile. She paused at Gareth's row, a well-rehearsed courtesy. "Are you certain you're all set?" she asked. "Need anything stored for you?" He politely declined. Harriet forced a tiny nod, then hurried away. She had other tasks to attend to, verifying overhead bin capacity, checking seat belts, dealing with a disorganized passenger who had too many carry-ons. Every minor inconvenience grated at her nerves. Just as final checks were completed and the aircraft began to taxi, Harriet felt a tightness in her chest. She had a fleeting thought of calling out sick, but it was far too late. The engines roared, and the plane took off into the dim morning sky. The seatbelt sign glowed overhead, and Harriet took her jump seat. Beside her, she noticed a fleeting reflection in the cabin window, her own face, lined with exhaustion and frustration. Meanwhile, in row 22, Vivienne Barrett observed everything with the keen instincts of a journalist. She had spotted Gareth, the cane, the confident posture despite his blindness. This had to be the man she was assigned to find. Vivienne was mentally crafting an approach. How would she introduce herself without seeming intrusive? This flight, ironically, might be the best chance she had. She also noticed the flight attendant's attitude. Harriet's forced smile did not go unnoticed. Vivienne could sense the tension in Harriet's movements, as though a million burdens weighed upon her. Vivian scribbled a quick note in her notepad. Flight attendant hostility. Something's off. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Vivian planned her move. She would approach Gareth during an opportune moment, perhaps when the seatbelt sign was off, and politely request a few minutes of his time. She had no idea how he would respond. Social media influencers could be unpredictable, some thrilled at free publicity, others fiercely protective of their privacy. Yet Vivienne had no inkling of the chaos that would soon erupt, nor how Harriet, in her moment of weakness, would become the linchpin of a scandal. After about 30 minutes in the air, the seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers exhaled with relief, shifting to more comfortable positions or lining up for the restroom. Harriet and another flight attendant began the beverage service, clinking ice cubes into plastic cups and distributing tiny bags of pretzels. Harriet had just reached Gareth's row. She plastered on a serviceable smile, albeit a strained one. "May I offer you something to drink?" "Water, please," Gareth answered. He leaned forward slightly, trying to position himself to catch the flight attendant's direction. Blind or not, Gareth had honed his other senses to notice subtle changes in the environment. He sensed Harriet's impatience, though she concealed it as best she could. When Harriet held out the water, Gareth carefully lifted his hand to meet hers halfway, ensuring he wouldn't accidentally knock it over. A small, seemingly innocuous slip happened. Harriet jerked her arm back a fraction too quickly, and water sloshed out of the cup, splashing onto Gareth's hand and shirt. He recoiled. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Harriet said tersely. She grabbed a napkin from her cart. The apology was grudging, more mechanical than empathetic. "It's all right," Gareth responded, wiping his shirt with the napkin. He felt the wet spot spreading across his collar. Though minor, the humiliating image of himself soaked in a plane seat began to sting. This was just the first crack in what would become a far more explosive interaction. Watching this minor mishap unfold, Vivienne felt her reporter's instincts prickle. She decided this was her window. She waited until Harriet moved away with the cart, then unfastened her seatbelt and approached Gareth's row. Sliding into the empty seat next to him, the occupant had gone to the restroom. She gently tapped him on the arm to signal her presence. "Excuse me," Vivienne said in a hushed tone. "I couldn't help but notice that the flight attendant spilled water on you." "Are you okay?" Gareth turned his face toward the voice. "I'll be fine. Accidents happen," he said. "I'm Vivian Barrett," she introduced herself. "I'm a freelance journalist. I think you might be Gareth Malone, the influencer and advocate for the visually impaired. I've been hoping to speak to you." Gareth froze for a moment. A fleeting surprise crossed his features. Though he was used to occasionally being recognized, it still caught him off guard, especially in such mundane settings. "I didn't expect to be recognized on a flight," Gareth admitted. "Yes, I'm Gareth Malone." Vivian felt a thrill of triumph, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Would you be open to a conversation? I'd love to hear more about your recent projects and any advice you might share for people with disabilities." Gareth was hesitant. His usual rule was to schedule interviews through official channels, but he sensed something genuine about Vivian's approach. And he was also aware that, thanks to his platform, shining more light on accessibility issues could be beneficial. "We can talk after the flight, or maybe during if it's not too disruptive," Gareth finally said. Vivian's eyes sparkled. "Thank you so much. I promise I won't take up too much of your time." She returned to her seat, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Little did she know that the interview she longed for would be overshadowed by events far darker than a mere spilled cup of water. Up in the galley, Harriet tried to steady her nerves. She replayed the image of water splashing onto Gareth. Her heart raced, not from guilt, but from simmering frustration at the day's mounting annoyances. She tried to remind herself of her training, remain calm, remain helpful, remain professional. Yet, as she rummaged through the galley drawers, searching for another stack of napkins. She overheard two passengers whispering about how incompetent flight attendants could be. Harriet clenched her fists. She felt personally attacked, even though the whispering might not have been about her specifically. Sleep deprivation, financial worries, and the fear of failing at her new job combined into a potent cocktail of anger. Her mind churned with resentful thoughts. Why did she have to be stuck on this flight dealing with so many demands? Why couldn't people cut her some slack? She knew she needed to reset her attitude, but there was precious little time. Soon she'd be distributing meals, then collecting trash, then dealing with 100 minor requests. There was an entire flight still ahead, and Harriet's patience was already wearing dangerously thin. An hour later, meal service began. Harriet, along with the other attendants, moved from row to row, offering passengers a choice of chicken or vegetarian pasta. The aisle became a narrow corridor of elbows and plastic trays. Vivienne, seated near Gareth, noticed how Harriet shot the blind man a quick, almost disdainful glance. As Harriet handed Gareth his tray, she spoke a little too loudly, almost as if he were hard of hearing instead of visually impaired. "Here's your meal, sir. Chicken with rice." "Thank you, I can hear just fine," Gareth replied politely, his tone unwavering. He'd encountered this brand of paternalistic treatment before. People often conflated blindness with a lack of hearing or cognition. A nearby passenger, a middle-aged man traveling with his wife, muttered something under his breath about the flight attendant's attitude. Harriet glanced sharply at them, her cheeks reddening. She served them their meals, then hurried on. But as she passed, she heard them whisper, "She's in the wrong line of work if she's going to behave like that to a blind man." Harriet's pulse pounded in her ears. She felt singled out, ridiculed. Paranoia began to seep in. Were all the passengers judging her? She pictured them at their destinations, recounting her perceived incompetence to family and friends. For Harriet, this wasn't just a job anymore, it was her lifeline. The frustration coiled in her gut like a rattlesnake, poised to strike. Gareth placed the plastic tray on his fold-down table. His fingers brushed over the tray's compartments, identifying the main dish, the side dish, and a small dessert. Carefully, he located the plastic utensils. Eating in confined airplane seats was challenging enough for a sighted person, but Gareth had mastered techniques to minimize spills. He used his left hand to gently guide each forkful. Across the aisle, an elderly lady noticed Gareth's careful maneuvering. She offered him a kind smile, which he returned. Moments later, Harriet came back through, collecting trash. She paused at Gareth's row, arms laden with crumpled napkins and empty cups from other passengers. "Are you finished yet?" she asked curtly, as though speaking to a child. "No, not yet," Gareth replied, a calm edge in his voice. "I'll hand it to you once I'm done." Harriet's lips thinned. She said nothing and moved on. But that small exchange, laden with tension, did not go unnoticed by the other passengers. More than a few pairs of eyes flicked warily between Harriet and Gareth, recognizing that something was amiss. Harriet was on her way back from the forward galley when she saw Gareth standing in the aisle, cane in hand, feeling his way toward the lavatory. He was navigating slowly, tapping the aisle to detect passengers' feet, overhead baggage protrusions, or snack carts. Spotting Harriet, he politely asked, "Could you please help guide me to the lavatory door?" Ordinarily, a flight attendant would do this without hesitation, but Harriet hesitated. She glanced at her watch, at the row of impatient faces waiting for her to complete another round of trash collection. She mumbled something inaudible. Then, with an aggravated sigh, she took Gareth's arm. "Here," she said hastily, pulling him forward. She opened the lavatory door and unceremoniously shoved him inside. Startled, Gareth almost lost his balance, dropping his cane. The sound of its metallic tip clanking onto the lavatory floor echoed in the cramped space. Harriet let the door slam shut behind him, brushing off the perplexed stares of nearby passengers. Inside, Gareth's heart pounded. He let out a shaky breath. Physical contact like that was rare. Typically, staff members were more cautious, especially with a blind passenger. Harriet's roughness stung more than any single word could. Not 5 minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some turbulence ahead, so please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." A flicker of worry darted through the cabin, the seatbelt sign illuminated with its familiar chime. Harriet hastened to secure the galley, stashing away service carts. Passengers scrambled to put away meal trays and personal items. Gareth, still in the lavatory, felt the plane begin to shake. He steadied himself against the small sink, waiting for the turbulence to subside enough to exit safely. Outside, Harriet stood rigid in the aisle, glaring at the closed lavatory door, reluctant to knock or offer assistance. Suddenly, the plane jolted violently, sending a shriek through the cabin as overhead bins rattled. Harriet lost her footing and stumbled against a seat. A few gasps rang out from passengers. With the corridor momentarily cleared, Harriet scowled at the lavatory door. She considered ignoring Gareth, but a flicker of guilt emerged. After all, it was standard procedure to ensure no passenger remained in the lavatory during heavy turbulence. Yet Harriet's frustration won out. She clung to a seatback and made her way to her jump seat, instead of guiding Gareth back to his seat. She buckled in, telling herself that Gareth could handle it alone. He was an adult. And this was just slight turbulence. Inside the cramped lavatory, Gareth felt the plane lurch again. He braced his arms on either side, his cane pressed against his thigh. The cabin's lights flickered momentarily. Another harsh jolt rattled the door, nearly flinging it open. Frowning, Gareth decided he needed to get back to his seat. He grasped for the lock, opened the door cautiously, and stepped into the aisle. The plane shook again. Gareth reached out, tapping his cane to find stable footing. But just then, Harriet, who was in her jump seat, shouted, "Sir, you need to sit down now." He nodded, disoriented by the sudden upheaval. "I'm trying." Another lurch caused Gareth to sway dangerously. Before he could steady himself, Harriet jumped up. In a flurry of confusion, she grabbed Gareth's shoulder. The impact of the jolt made her grip slip, and her open palm inadvertently smacked Gareth across the cheek. A shocked hush seized the nearby passengers. Gareth staggered, his cane flailing. The blow had not been a gentle tap, it stung. He reflexively raised his hand to his face, reeling from the shock. For a moment, it felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. Passengers near row 14 stared with wide eyes, uncertain whether they had witnessed an accident or an intentional act. Gareth's face burned, both from the sting of the slap and the humbling sense of powerlessness. Harriet's eyes widened. She took a step back, looking as stunned as Gareth. Yet in her mind, an ugly swirl of panic and anger erupted. She wanted to scream, to deny, to vanish. This was her worst nightmare. A confrontation with a disabled passenger, right in the middle of the cabin, with eyewitnesses. I'm sorry," Harriet stuttered, though her tone was more defensive than remorseful. "You lost your balance. It was an accident." Gareth swallowed, trying to maintain his composure. The entire scene felt unreal. He managed to steady himself. "I'm fine," he finally said, though his voice shook with shock. The seatbelt sign remained on, the plane still trembling with occasional fits of turbulence. Harriet quickly retreated to her jump seat, heart pounding. At that moment, she didn't fully comprehend that her action, a single, open-palmed strike, would become the catalyst for a much bigger storm. Passengers began to whisper in hushed, urgent tones. The middle-aged couple who had noticed Harriet's earlier outbursts looked at each other gravely. The wife held her hand over her mouth, stunned by what she had just witnessed. Another young passenger tapped on her phone, presumably to write down details or maybe even record them. Vivienne Barrett, the journalist, had been dozing lightly just before the turbulence hit. She opened her eyes to see the tail end of the commotion, Gareth reeling, Harriet's palm still outstretched. Though she hadn't seen the exact moment of impact, the outcome was glaringly evident. Adrenaline surged in Vivienne. She unbuckled her seatbelt and rushed to Gareth, ignoring the seatbelt sign's warning. "Are you okay?" she asked, gently touching his shoulder. Gareth was breathing unevenly, still disoriented. "I think so." Vivienne noticed the red mark blooming on his cheek. Anger flared within her. She had no right. Let's just get me back to my seat," Gareth said quietly. With Vivienne's help, Gareth found his seat. As he sank down, trembling slightly, he tried to collect his thoughts. The humiliation washed over him in waves. Slapped by a flight attendant in front of a plane full of onlookers. How had it come to this? Turbulence subsided a few minutes later, and the captain turned off the seatbelt sign once more. A wave of relief rustled through the passengers, but an uneasy tension still hung in the cabin. Harriet unfastened her harness, face flushed. She tried to focus on her responsibilities, but her mind was spiraling. She rationalized to herself, "It was an accident. I was trying to help him." Yet even as she thought this, she knew her emotions were frayed and her actions had gone too far. Her lower lip trembled with the weight of possible consequences. She could be reported, fired, sued. Panic rose in her chest. Nevertheless, Harriet wore her professional mask. She moved through the cabin, checking on passengers mechanically, avoiding Gareth's row. Inwardly, she was screaming with a mix of fear, anger, and pride. If any passenger tried to confront her, would she muster an apology or remain defiant? She truly didn't know. Unbeknownst to Harriet, multiple passengers had recorded snippets of the slap on their phones, though the turbulence made some of the footage shaky. One passenger in particular, an avid social media user, was already drafting a post to share the appalling incident. Another was rummaging through airline policies online, curious about the legalities of assaulting a passenger, particularly one with a disability. In seat 22, Vivienne stared at Gareth's cheek, her journalistic mind churning. If she broke this story, it would go viral almost instantly. But as she studied Gareth's somber expression, she sensed his hesitation. He was a private figure, despite his millions of followers. The last thing he might want was a viral confrontation, overshadowing his philanthropic work. But Vivienne also believed that such behavior from a flight attendant no less couldn't be swept under the rug. This was about more than a famous influencer being hurt. This was about respect, compassion, and the boundaries of professional ethics. The cabin intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be experiencing smooth flying for the next hour and a half or so. Feel free to move about the cabin if necessary." Shortly after, a tall, broad-shouldered figure emerged from the flight deck. Captain Raymond Holt. He was the pilot in command and had been informed by a flight attendant about the disturbance. Though Harriet had only given the barest details, an unintentional contact with a challenging passenger, Captain Holt knew better than to brush it off. In-flight altercations rarely ended well, especially if there were allegations of misconduct. He approached Gareth's row. "Sir, I'm Captain Holt. I heard there was a bit of a situation. May I ask if you're all right?" Gareth tilted his head, face still taut with residual stress. "I'm okay, Captain. I was accidentally struck by a member of your cabin crew." A hush fell over the surrounding rows. The captain tried to maintain a calm, authoritative demeanor. "I'm sorry you experienced that. Would you like to lodge a formal complaint? If so, I can make sure we handle this promptly upon landing." Harriet hovered a few rows away, watching with bated breath. Her colleagues whispered uneasily. Gareth hesitated, remembering the countless times he'd faced adversity because of his blindness. He had typically chosen the path of deflection, not wanting to stir up trouble. But the echo of the slap and Harriet's earlier impatience was too vivid to dismiss. He exhaled. "Yes, Captain. I do want to file a complaint. This shouldn't happen to any passenger, disabled or not." The captain nodded solemnly. "We'll document everything properly. We will also need the flight attendant's account, as well as any witness statements. Meanwhile, if you need anything ice for your cheek, perhaps please let me or any other member of the crew know." Gareth managed a tight nod. "Thank you." Captain Holt moved on, making a mental note to radio ahead for ground support. Harriet avoided his gaze, her heart pounding louder by the minute. Her career flashed before her eyes. She had worked so hard to land a position at Delta Airlines, one of the most reputable carriers in the country. Would she lose it all because of a single moment of lost composure? Vivian quietly slipped across the aisle to Gareth's side. "I'm sorry that happened," she said softly. "No one deserves that. If you need a witness, I'll speak on your behalf." Gareth's stoic facade cracked slightly. Gratitude flickered across his face. "Thank you. I really appreciate that." In the back of her mind, Vivian was also crafting an article. She saw the potential for a story that exposed more than just Harriet's behavior. It could spotlight the daily struggles of people with disabilities in public spaces. It could also examine the airline's response to misconduct by its staff. Whether Gareth wanted that level of publicity or not, Vivienne suspected that the story would surface regardless. Footage was already out there, in the hands of passengers with social media at their fingertips. Eventually, Harriet mustered the courage to approach Gareth. Her eyes were hollow, ringed with fatigue and regret. She knelt beside his seat, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to apologize," she began haltingly. "I didn't mean to strike you. I was trying to help." And the turbulence. Gareth remained silent for a moment, sensing the weight of her trembling words. "I'm not sure I believe it was entirely accidental," he finally said, his voice controlled but firm. "Your behavior this entire flight has been hostile. If it was truly an accident, then I hope you'll understand that your attitude made it very hard to see it that way." Tears threatened to pool in Harriet's eyes, but she kept them at bay. "Please, if you press charges, or if you go public with this, I could lose everything. I'm supporting my family. My parent has medical bills." Gareth sighed, deeply conflicted. He empathized with personal struggles, but the sting on his cheek reminded him that compassion had not been reciprocated. "I'm sorry for your difficulties," he said softly, "but that doesn't excuse your behavior." Harriet opened her mouth to plead further, but an older flight attendant signaled her from the galley, reminding her of her duties. Harriet stood, her expression haunted, and retreated. From the economy cabin to first class, whispers about the incident multiplied like wildfire. One passenger confided in another. "Did you hear? The flight attendant slapped a blind man." Another passenger claimed to have the entire event recorded. People were scouring their phone cameras, searching for evidence of the moment. In row 29, a group of young adults was huddled around a smartphone, reviewing a shaky video clip. Through the unsteady footage, Harriet's palm could be seen connecting with Gareth's face. While the jolt of turbulence was evident, the conversation preceding and following it hinted at aggression on Harriet's part. The clip, albeit unsteady, was damning enough to provoke outrage. "We should post this," one of them whispered, eyes alight with indignation. "This is unacceptable." Back in the galley, Harriet was losing composure. Her palms were sweaty and her throat felt parched. She dreaded the moment they would land. The possibility of being escorted away by airport security or fired on the spot loomed large in her mind. She tried to imagine alternative scenarios. Perhaps Gareth would forgive her. Perhaps the airline would only issue a warning. Yet deep down, Harriet sensed that the storm was too big. Word of mouth alone, spread across the entire cabin, would be enough to incite a formal inquiry. And if anyone had even a second of it on video, that would spell disaster. Another hour passed in tense limbo. Gareth sat quietly, leaning against the window as though seeking solace in the faint hum of the engines. Vivienne occasionally glanced over, considering how to approach him about the interview, but she decided to give him space. He was already under enough stress. At one point, Harriet ventured down the aisle to offer water or beverages. Her demeanor was subdued, her face drawn with remorse. Some passengers refused her offer, glaring at her in disapproval. Others demanded to speak with the captain or with higher management upon landing. Harriet's shoulders hunched further with each rejection. Gareth overheard these reactions, and though his cheek still smarted, he felt an odd pang of sympathy. Still, he knew that it wasn't up to him to shield Harriet from the consequences of her own actions. With about 2 hours remaining in the flight, Harriet found herself busily reorganizing supplies in the galley to prepare for the second beverage service. She was twisting the cap onto a large water container when a sudden jolt of mild turbulence sent her stumbling backward straight into a scalding coffee pot. The pot's contents splashed her hand, eliciting a yelp of pain. Another flight attendant rushed forward with a wet cloth. Harriet's eyes watered from the sting. She gritted her teeth, recalling the phrase karmic retribution from somewhere deep in her mind. Ironically, or so it felt, the universe seemed to be punishing her in small doses for what she had done to Gareth. Moments later, Harriet was cradling her reddened hand beneath cold running water in the galley sink. One of her colleagues, a senior flight attendant named Maurice, stood by her side. "Harriet," Maurice said gently, "tell me what really happened out there." She looked up, tears threatening to spill. I lost my temper," she admitted brokenly. "Things have been rough lately, but that's no excuse. When he was in the aisle, we hit turbulence, and maybe I didn't try hard enough to avoid that contact. I'm not even sure anymore if it was truly an accident." Maurice sighed heavily. "The airline will do an investigation. Passengers probably have footage." "You know that, right?" Harriet's eyes squeezed shut. "I can't lose this job." "I know," Maurice said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "But you have to be honest. You'll have to face the consequences, whatever they may be." Down the aisle, Vivienne opened her laptop, intending to jot down the skeletal framework of the story. She typed furiously, recalling every detail since she'd boarded the plane. Yet as her fingers flew over the keys, a pang of doubt made her pause. She glanced at Gareth, who was resting with headphones on. Would releasing this story complete with footage, interviews, and sensational headlines truly serve justice? Or would it turn Gareth into an even bigger spectacle? She wrestled with the ethics. On one hand, Harriet's behavior was appalling and needed to be exposed. On the other, Gareth's privacy and well-being mattered too. Vivienne made a choice. She would wait to speak to Gareth first. If he wanted to keep this private, she would respect that. But if he felt the need for public accountability, she would do everything in her power to amplify his story. The airplane lurched. Captain Holt's voice came over the intercom again, sounding unusually tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been alerted to a technical issue that needs immediate inspection. For everyone's safety, we'll be diverting to McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas. Please stay seated and follow instructions from the crew." Anxious murmurs rippled through the cabin. Harriet and the other flight attendants glanced at one another. A diversion meant unexpected paperwork, potentially added stress for Harriet. She swallowed hard, focusing on the immediate task of ensuring passenger safety. Gareth furrowed his brow. Diverting would make the flight longer. This entire ordeal was turning into an endless loop of discomfort. He tried to steady his breathing, wishing he could just fast forward time. When the plane touched down in Las Vegas, a wave of relief washed over everyone. Paramedics waited on the tarmac, though no injuries beyond Harriet's scalded hand were reported. Maintenance crews swarmed the plane, searching for the technical glitch the cockpit had indicated. A cluster of airline representatives stood by the gate, conferring with Captain Holt. Harriet's name was mentioned frequently, and her posture sagged. Gareth overheard snippets about passenger assault, corporate policy, and possible termination. He felt torn. Part of him recognized Harriet's humanity, but he also knew she had crossed a line. A customer service supervisor named Marla approached Gareth as passengers disembarked for what was announced as a 2-hour delay. She introduced herself softly, explaining that she had been informed of the in-flight altercation. "We take these matters extremely seriously, Mr. Malone," Marla said. "If you're willing, we'd like your statement, and we have other passengers who claim to have video footage. We'd also like to know if you'd like to press charges." Gareth's expression reflected his conflict. He inhaled slowly, remembering Harriet's tearful plea about her financial struggles. Yet the sting in his cheek remained fresh. "I want to give a statement," he said, measured. "But as far as charges, I'm not sure yet." Marla nodded, compassion in her gaze. "I understand. We're here to support you, no matter your decision." Shortly after, Harriet was taken aside by the airline's representatives. Her scalded hand was wrapped in a bandage. She looked as though she'd aged years in the span of hours. Her mind whirled with a single question: how did it all go so wrong? She recounted the incident, her voice shaky. "Yes, there was turbulence. Yes, I tried to help him. But," she stopped, swallowing the lump in her throat, "my emotions got the better of me. My actions were out of line, whether I intended harm or not. I accept responsibility." The supervisors exchanged glances, impressed by her honesty but bound by protocol. "We'll have to see the footage and gather statements," one of them said. "For now, you'll be placed on administrative leave pending the investigation." Meanwhile, Vivienne gently guided Gareth into a quiet corner of the airport terminal, away from the curious eyes of other passengers. She explained her profession and her original goal of interviewing him about his philanthropic work. Then she relayed her dilemma. "Videos are circulating. People are outraged. I could write an expose. But I wanted to get your input first. Do you want to keep this quiet? Or do you feel that shedding public light on it could help highlight the broader issues: discrimination, abuse of power, how people with disabilities are sometimes treated?" Gareth ran a hand through his hair, taking a moment to process. "I never sought to become a news headline because of something like this. But maybe it could do some good." He paused. "Not in a sensationalized way, though. I don't want Harriet publicly crucified without context. She has her own struggles." Vivienne nodded. "I'd do my best to represent the facts fairly." With a deep sigh, Gareth answered, "Then let's do it. If it can open eyes and push for better training for flight staff, I'm in." A sense of clarity settled between them. Vivienne had her story, but it would be nuanced, an exploration of both Harriet's wrongdoing and Gareth's unwavering commitment to empathy. While Gareth was giving his statement to Marla, the middle-aged couple who had witnessed the slap approached. They confirmed the details. Harriet had been behaving rudely throughout the flight, culminating in that slap. They also noted Gareth's remarkable poise and courtesy, even under distress. Other passengers chimed in similarly, though a few cautioned that the turbulence might have contributed to the physical contact. The airline representatives nodded, noting every detail. It was clear Harriet's overall demeanor had laid the foundation for everyone's negative perception of her. After an hour of waiting, Harriet was led into a small, nondescript office near the gate. There, she found Gareth seated, accompanied by Marla and a pair of airline supervisors. Gareth's expression was calm but resolute. Harriet swallowed the lump in her throat. One supervisor spoke first, her tone formal. "Miss Kavanagh, we've reviewed preliminary evidence and statements. It's clear your behavior was unacceptable. However, we also acknowledge that the turbulence played a role in the physical contact. We will be conducting an internal investigation, but we also need to address the possibility of legal repercussions." Harriet's voice trembled. "I understand. I'm prepared to accept the consequences. But I hope you'll consider everything I'm under immense personal stress, though that doesn't excuse my actions." All eyes turned to Gareth. "I won't lie, I'm hurt and frustrated," he began. "But I also see that Harriet is remorseful. For my part, I won't press criminal charges. However, I do expect a sincere apology, and I hope the airline will take steps to ensure this doesn't happen again." Harriet's eyes brimmed with tears. "I am truly sorry, Mr. Malone. I've been working through a lot, but I know that's no justification for how I treated you. I hope you can forgive me." Gareth nodded slowly. "I accept your apology." A wave of relief visibly swept over Harriet, though she also looked utterly spent. The airline supervisors exchanged glances, scribbling notes. "We'll finalize a decision soon," one of them said. "But for now, Harriet, you remain on administrative leave while we complete the process." After repairs and checks, the plane was ready to continue its journey. A new flight attendant replaced Harriet for the remainder of the flight. Passengers reboarded, many of them still abuzz about the incident. Harriet stood at the terminal gate, watching them file in, barred from returning to work on this flight. Gareth felt a tug of pity when he glimpsed Harriet standing there, tears threatening to break free again. She gave him a small, trembling wave, and he nodded in return. Then he boarded the plane, cane in hand, guided by a sympathetic gate agent. The final leg to Los Angeles was comparatively quiet. Vivian took the chance to interview Gareth about accessibility advocacy, capturing the story behind his philanthropic pursuits. Yet tension still hung in the air, fueled by the knowledge that a shocking altercation had forever changed the dynamic of this flight. As the plane touched down at LAX, the sun was dipping low on the horizon. Gareth felt both exhaustion and relief. This journey had been a roller coaster of emotions, from being humiliated to experiencing compassion from strangers. At the arrival gate, paparazzi were conspicuously absent thanks in part to Gareth's privacy measures, but a few curious onlookers had caught wind of the story on social media. They snapped photos and video clips of him disembarking. Vivian escorted him through the gate, occasionally giving short quotes to a few local reporters who had shown up in response to the viral videos. Gareth's phone buzzed incessantly. Friends, colleagues and fans from around the globe had caught wind of the scandal. He read supportive messages, along with others demanding Harriet be fired, arrested, or worse. Closing his phone, Gareth reflected on how quickly public opinion could turn into a mob. Within hours, video clips circulated widely online, racking up millions of views. Harriet Kavanagh's name was initially withheld, but it leaked soon enough. The comment sections were rife with anger and condemnation. Some netizens, however, urged empathy, pointing out that Harriet might have mental health issues or extreme stress. Others zeroed in on the notion that no matter her problems, slapping a blind passenger was inexcusable. Harriet's personal social media accounts were bombarded with messages, some hateful, some sympathetic. She felt cornered, overwhelmed, and alone. The airline had offered her psychological counseling and told her to stay off social media while the investigation proceeded. Meanwhile, Gareth posted a carefully worded statement on his Instagram account, addressing his millions of followers. He clarified the situation, confirming that while he was struck by a flight attendant, he believed that demonizing her would not solve anything. He urged empathy and better training for airline staff, along with improved awareness of passengers with disabilities. In closing, he wrote, "Let this be a lesson that we never truly know what someone else might be going through. We don't excuse harmful actions, but we strive to understand them and push for positive change." His post went viral, triggering widespread discussion about disability rights, airline accountability, and mental health support in the workplace. A week later, Delta Airlines released an official statement. Harriet Kavanaugh had been terminated from her position. The investigation had concluded that even though turbulence contributed to the physical contact, her overall conduct was unprofessional and against the airline's core values. Harriet received the news in her tiny apartment, tears rolling down her cheeks. She had hoped for a second chance. The next day, a letter arrived from an attorney representing Gareth Malone. To her surprise, it wasn't a lawsuit, but rather a notice that Gareth was formally dropping any potential civil charges. Inside the envelope was a short handwritten note. "I'm sorry for your struggles. I hope you find a way forward and learn from this, Gareth." Months passed. Gareth continued to travel, championing accessible technology, working with non-profits, and sharing glimpses of his life with his adoring followers. The flight attendant scandal had died down, replaced by other viral stories. Yet Harriet's life had been uprooted. She struggled to find employment in customer-facing roles. No one wanted to hire a flight attendant who had gained notoriety for slapping a passenger. Still, she persevered, taking odd jobs to pay rent and medical bills. She also sought therapy to deal with her stress and anger management issues. One day, Harriet noticed a job opening at a local assisted living facility. They needed a staff member to assist with daily tasks for blind and low-vision residents. A wave of humility washed over her. "Could I do this?" she wondered. "Maybe it's time to atone, to learn to serve others with compassion." She applied. During the interview, she confessed her past mistakes. The hiring manager, a sharp-eyed older woman, studied her intently. "You seem sincere," she finally said. "People can change. We all deserve a chance to prove it." Thus, Harriet embarked on a new path. The memory of that slap and Gareth's unexpected mercy propelled her forward, a constant reminder that while mistakes can shatter lives, compassion and accountability can also rebuild them. Meanwhile, Gareth continued to break barriers in the influencer world. With Vivian Barrett's help, he published a powerful op-ed in a major newspaper, advocating for disability awareness and emphasizing the importance of empathy in all professions, especially those involving customer service. The article highlighted the airline incident but did not vilify Harriet. Instead, it underscored systemic changes required to prevent future incidents. Gareth's philanthropic efforts expanded, and he donated part of his income to programs that trained airline staff in disability sensitivity. Collaborations with tech giants blossomed, bringing improved accessibility features to smartphones and everyday appliances. He traveled globally, speaking at conferences and sharing his story, including the humiliating slap that had ignited a transformative conversation. About a year after the incident, fate, or perhaps serendipity, brought Gareth and Harriet together again. Gareth was invited to tour an assisted living facility renowned for its robust programs for blind and visually impaired residents. He was scheduled to give a motivational talk and personally test some new assistive technologies. As he was guided through the building, cane in hand, he heard a familiar voice softly instructing a visually impaired resident in the hallway. He froze, momentarily uncertain if it was just his imagination, but sure enough, Harriet stepped into his path. Her eyes widened, and she nearly dropped a stack of Braille pamphlets. In an instant, a flood of memories and shameful regrets flashed across her features. Gareth, too, felt the old wound resurface. He recalled the sting of her palm, the humiliation, the entire fiasco that followed. But Harriet's presence here, in a place dedicated to assisting people with disabilities, spoke volumes. She bowed her head. "Mr. Malone, Gareth, He finished the sentence for her with a gentle nod. "Harriet, I see you're working here now." She swallowed, tears pricking her eyes. "Yes, I started about 9 months ago. It's been the most humbling and rewarding work I've ever done. I'm learning so much about how to better serve and understand people with visual impairments." She paused, trembling. "I can't tell you how sorry I still am for what happened." Gareth paused, letting his cane rest against his leg. "I can tell you've changed," he finally said, voice quiet but warm. "I'm glad you found a way to help others." Harriet's tears finally escaped, rolling down her cheeks. She managed a small smile of gratitude. "Thank you." As they parted ways, Gareth felt a weight lift from his heart. Harriet had sought redemption, and it seemed she had found it. He, too, had found a deeper sense of purpose, turning a harrowing experience into a catalyst for positive change. As our story touches down, we're reminded that life's greatest challenges can give rise to the most significant transformations. From the humiliation and shock of that fateful slap, Gareth emerged more committed than ever to advocating for those who face obstacles in everyday life. Harriet, once teetering on the brink of losing everything, discovered a second chance through humility, accountability, and genuine empathy. Their paths serve as powerful examples that from turmoil, change can blossom, and compassion may triumph over cruelty. If this story resonated with you, please support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Help us spread inspiring narratives that shine a light on resilience and redemption. Stay tuned for more captivating tales that touch the heart.